And he continued to explore different applications for his amazing fabrics, producing a variety of beautiful evening dresses and housecoats and robes. But he pretty quickly realized that robes and tunics and jackets that are this unique present a real problem. You can't wear them with anything else. You can't just put them on over some other dress you have. And Fortuny realized that they were crying out for an undergarment that was neutral enough to allow the textiles to be the primary focus, but would also further the aesthetic, a sort of pedestal for his creations. In 1907, Fortuny introduced his Delphos gown. It's a simple column of pleated silk, which is at the same time a rich celebration of texture and color, but also a neutral layer to complement his patterned Nassau scarves, his jackets, his coats, and his tunics. He filed a patent which was granted in 1909 for a machine-to-pleat fabric, although the actual process still remains a secret, which amazes me. It is probably finger-pleated when wet and then set with heat. We only know what the device looks like, not how it's used. And each panel of fabric winds up containing about 450 pleats, so it's no small undertaking. The pleats can be maintained by storing the dress in a tightly wound ball in a custom-made box. Alone, or in tandem with other Fortuny textiles, the Delphos dress created a real sensation. Marcel Proust, who had been a regular at the salon Fortuny's mother hosted in Paris, wrote in La Prisonnière in 1923, "The Fortuny dress Albertine wore that night seemed like the tantalizing shadow of invisible Venice. It was covered in Arab ornamentation, just like Venice, just like Venetian palaces disguised as sultans behind a veil pierced with stones, just like the binding in the Ambrosian library, just like the columns with oriental birds that alternately mean life and death and are repeated in the mirage of the clothes, in a deep blue that, as my eyes approached it, became changeable, thanks to the same transmutations that, in front of the advancing gondola, became metal inflaming the azure of the Grand Canal, and the sleeves were lined in a cherry pink that is so Venetian it is especially called Tiepolo pink." At the time, in 1907, everything that defined what a woman was and what a woman could be was in flux. In 1893, it was New Zealand that first granted suffrage to women, giving women the vote, and that was a struggle which triumphed around the world shortly after that. Female doctors won the right to practice at the time, and women were starting to have very public successes in fields that had been closed to them before. The redefining of women found a welcome redefining of the female silhouette in Fortuny's Delphos dress. With its form-clinging pleats and flowing loose lines, it's a celebration of the woman's form and of liberation. There's emphasis of a woman's figure instead of constriction. This is a picture of Selma Schubert, who was Alfred Stieglitz's sister, in a rare early color photograph by Stieglitz. And she's wearing a Delphos dress in 1907, and everything about her, her silhouette, her attitude, even that it's a color picture in 1907, is a completely different, forward-looking idea about what a woman should be. In 1907, a tea dress, which is a dress intended to be worn in the afternoon while entertaining, was not a casual affair. The corseted, constrained rigidity of the Edwardian woman was very formal, and the dress used a vast quantity of fabric and structure. A Fortuny dress, on the other hand, was a single layer of fabric, without foundation garments, and with a freedom of movement that must have been electrifying, if not bordering on obscene. Even tea dresses by famous designers from the day can't compare to Fortuny's level of innovation. They're beautiful garments, but they're modern versions of old-fashioned types of clothing. These are Fortuny's patents from 1912 and 1914, where he patented the actual construction of some of his garments. And to me, they seem like almost an abuse of the patent system, because it's just, how do I attach two panels of fabric? However, even though Fortuny was referencing ancient classical robes, this approach to dressmaking was remarkably novel for its day. It's the very simplicity of construction that made the garments worthy of a patent. The dress didn't come from nowhere. On one hand, it's a material study. Fortuny looked at what he could do with the tools he had available and arrived at that method of pleating. On the other hand, it's a response to a need. He needed to make a pedestal for his other garments, but there are also plenty of classical references that he was knowingly making. The dress is clearly inspired by the classical Greek chiton, the robe, and it was named after the charioteer of Delphi, which had been discovered in 1896. So it's a very knowing reference to this form of clothing. And there are even older precedents, not just for the loose silhouette of the dress, but also for the pleating. Both of these sculptures are at the Louvre and were when Fortuny lived in Paris, and he certainly would have been familiar with them. In addition to classical references, Fortuny was influenced by Moroccan kaftans and old Tunisian garments, many of which he collected and his father had collected. Fortuny developed an extended family of variations on the original Delphos dress and found great success. Over 100 workers bustled away in the top floor of the Palazzo's workrooms, and Fortuny opened boutiques in Paris and in London. He showed his fabrics in 1914 in New York, although World War I prevented overseas distribution, and that had to be picked up after the war. Gabriele D'Annunzio wrote after seeing Henriette Fortuny wearing an early version of the dress in 1910, "She was enveloped in one of those long oriental gauze scarves that the alchemist dyer Mariano Fortuny submerges in the mysterious potions of his cauldrons, stirring them with a wooden stick, first like a sylph, then like a gnome, where he obtains colors from strange dreams, and later prints them with his thousands of new generations of stars, plants, and animals." Many of the great artists of the day embraced the Delphos dress, making it a real symbol of modernity. On the left is Isadora Duncan with her daughter and her poet husband, and on the right, a Georges Barbier drawing of her dancing in a Delphos dress. This is Lillian Gish, one of America's greatest silent screen actresses at the peak of her career, and on the right, a very colorful woman, Natasha Rambova, who was Rudolph Valentino's wife and a Hollywood costume and set designer. This is French music hall star Regine Fleury, and Lady Bonham Carter, who was daughter of Asquith, the British Prime Minister. She was, in her own right, a politician, an orator, a very close friend of Winston Churchill's, and grandmother of Helena Bonham Carter. So for anyone out there in the Harry Potter generation, here's a direct link from Mariano Fortuny to Bellatrix Lestrange. From 1920 on, Fortuny produced yardage of many of his patterns for use in interiors, and it's a remarkable collection and range of types of techniques of working with fabric and resultant images. It's important to note that he didn't always design the patterns. Fortuny's interest was primarily in finding modern ways to simulate ancient textiles and recreating and interpreting important textile designs, mostly seen in paintings. He was a great collector of textile patterns from fine art paintings. This is Eleanor of Toledo and her son Giovanni by Bronzino, and on the right the Fortuny fabric inspired by her dress. I think the Fortuny story gets even better because as he develops, he looks for ways to fold all of his interests together. And for me, that's the sign of a great innovator. Each problem that gets solved isn't put away. The solution is kept active and becomes part of all future solutions, so that the problem solving is sort of cyclical more than it is linear. Fortuny combined his passion for pattern and fabric and his ability to produce remarkably elegant and complicated patterns on silk with his understanding of electric light and how to manipulate it. Among the early commercially available electric lamps, long before we figured out what electric light fixtures could be with any sort of design authority, Fortuny was producing these remarkable silk pendant electric lamps. These lamps continue to be made today by Venetia Studio, and that's rare for a career to venture through so much and so many varied territories, but how rarer still to find a way to circle around and give the variety of those interests and successes a combined and unified expression. It would be easy to forget that Fortuny considered himself primarily a painter, and I think that's kind of hilarious to have had such radical, widespread success in so many fields, but still define yourself as a fine artist. He painted throughout his career, and his style developed throughout as well, along with his experience and the changing times. The central interest in his paintings were landscapes and the female form and luxurious fabrics. They all are infused with a sensuality and an exotic flavor, and that's true from the beginning all the way through the end of his paintings. Fortuny died in 1949. Operations at the factory on the island of Giudecca were taken over by Elsie McNeil Lee, who had been distributing his work in New York City since 1928. In 1994, the Rayad family took over the operations, and today they continue to produce Fortuny's fabrics. Henriette donated the palazzo and its contents to the city of Venice in 1956, and she lived until 1965. Today, the palazzo is a museum and well worth a visit. So that's a little Mariano Fortuny 101. He's one of my favorite figures in design history, oftentimes left out of conversations about the history of design because no one knows quite where to put him, and my argument would be put him everywhere.